Good afternoon, everyone, and it's certainly a pleasure to be here, and an honor to be able to talk with you for a few moments. I know that we're behind time, so I'll go quickly. One of the things that happens when you're one of the last speakers in the afternoon is that most of the things that you had planned to talk about have already been spoken about. And so I'm here to tell you that I'm going to wing it. And I'm going to wing it in several ways. And one of them is by showing you my disclosures. And I would like to know, how many of you do not show your hands? How many of you have just formed an opinion on what I think about red meat? How many of you have formed that opinion without actually talking to me? We are all full of biases. And we are all full of agendas, and we are all full of stuff. And it's always helpful when that stuff gets set aside. You sort of check your guns at the door type of thing when you come to a meeting like this, so that you're not selectively hearing, so that you're only hearing what you want to hear. And I would encourage all of us for the next day and today, the rest of the day, and this evening and tomorrow, for those of you who will be here, to remember that we all have biases, and we all have agendas, and some of them are monetary, some of them are academic, and some of them are governmental, and some of them are things that I don't know about. But I, as an academic, could care less if you eat meat. I could care less if you're a vegetarian. I think that vegetarianism is absolutely a very healthy eating pattern. For the record, I do not believe in flexitarianism. Flexitarianism is a vegetarian who can't get their act together. Or an omnivore who really has an inner soul to find. So let me start by asking a couple of questions. How many of you have thought about what you're going to eat tonight based on what we've heard today so far, and whether or not the menu will include meat? If you get bored with my talk, I would encourage you to Google edible insect food pictures. I did it earlier this afternoon. I can assure you there is a cookbook. Okay. I can also assure you that there was not one picture of something that was not packaged. So if you're talking about environmental sustainability, maybe you want to factor in the package. And most importantly, I'd like you to ask yourself whether or not what we're really talking about here is worrying about protein or protein-rich foods, and whether or not the protein itself is really the issue that is dominant, or whether or not it's how what people are going to consume as food that are rich in proteins. So when we look at I threw in a couple of slides just so that you knew that I checked out whether or not there are edible insects. And indeed, according to very selective articles that I picked, I did not do a meta-analysis. Insects that are traditionally foods across many parts of the world are highly nutritious and especially rich in proteins, and thus represent a potential food and protein source. And as you can read in the next paragraph, there is a description of a number of minerals, vitamins, amino acids, polyunsaturated fatty acids, monounsaturated fatty acids that are particularly potentially abundant in insects, and specifically. But yet, if you took a look at that list, isn't that the same list as red meat? Do you know that red meat is 50% of the fatty acids in red meat is monounsaturates? Everybody talks about the saturates, but what about the monounsaturates? Traditional foods and technologies, the nutritional and technological properties of food protein ingredients depend on their source, extraction and purification, modification during food manufacture, and interactions with other food components. To me, that suggests a high degree of processing. From a nutritional standpoint and from a protein-centric perspective, the first thing that you want to look at is the amino acid composition. And indeed, and just how much protein it is. As you look on the left-hand side, on a dry weight basis, most of the insects that are listed here stack up quite nicely compared to beef, eggs, milk, soybeans. And when you look at the branched chain amino acids and leucine contents, the insects are comparable. I really appreciated noting the other information earlier today regarding some of the other essential amino acids. I hadn't found that before, so thank you. So what are we talking about when we think about protein quality? Let's talk about protein quality first. Overall protein quality measures derived from nitrogen balance and whole body nitrogen retention data represent the most ubiquitous evaluation of dietary protein quality. For those of you who are nutritionists or have had a nutrition class that was years ago as opposed to more recently, that statement may either feel comforting or quite disturbing because the word nitrogen balance is in there. And the realities are that while there's all sorts of kinetics data, isostable isotopes, fancy other technologies in trying to look at protein for its various chemical, mechanical properties and the like, most of our information that we use now, not only for animal feed but also for human feed, is based on literally 50 to 70-year-old technologies. And that's not likely to change anytime soon unless the dietary reference intakes are updated. But yet, the more important part of this statement by Dr. Tomei is that other criteria related to nitrogen retention in different parts of the body, the metabolic responses to target tissues, muscle, bone, hormones, are really more important to us than just the content of the amino acids, because ultimately what we care about is health. And so while and especially those of you who have either funded or conducted research on whether or not one particular protein source has an advantage to stimulating some sort of a protein synthesis rate or some other mechanical property or metabolic property, ultimately the reality is that we eat a variety of proteins in a variety of situations. And ultimately, we want to make sure that we are just functionally healthy enough to do the things that we like to do and that we need to do. And that includes eating protein-rich foods. Nonetheless, though, there are nutritional values that are important in defining what a particular protein is. And I am sure, we would be scientifically remiss if we did not take the time and do due diligence to evaluate the new protein, the emerging protein sources that we're talking about today, using these in comparison to what we're already consuming. For example, with respect to the true digestibility. I know that these data are based on the PD-Cas values and that there is now a DIAS value that is considered to be more appropriate. However, the DIAS values really just aren't available even for our traditional protein sources on a variety of products, let alone the emerging ones. But we certainly know that on an amino acid composition basis and on a digestibility basis, for the most part, animal-based proteins are superior to plant-based proteins. And I mentioned here about the DIAS values. And even when you're talking about trying to find a new technology for measuring something that is as traditional as the digestibility and availability of amino acids in our diet, statements like the one in black emerge as very poignant. Before adopting this new technology, the DIAS method, as a framework for supporting protein content claims, updated food-related regulations and policies should also be evaluated through the lens that anticipates, and this really gets to the heart of this whole meeting, is the integration and the complexities of all the issues that are being addressed. The impact of consumer facing nutrition communication, the adoption of dietary patterns that are nutritionally adequate, and a nutrition and a food value chain that fosters a spirit of food and nutrition innovation. The comment earlier, which I really appreciate, was that the people that sell the feed to the farmers don't care about what happens to humans. It's the farmer's job to worry about us. I would actually have a slightly different perspective. I'd really like everybody to be worrying about us. So here's a rhetorical question. Should future alternative protein-rich foods be geared to replace primarily animal or plant-based protein sources? Based on what? Amino acid content, digestibility, bioaccessibility, non-protein components? Haven't heard anything today about replacing a soybean, or replacing a kidney bean, or replacing some other staple plant-based protein. Yet when you're thinking about what the consumer may like, we as a society eat 65% of our proteins from animal-based sources. That means that there's a lot of room to make people unhappy because they're used to eating that. But it's also a possibility that they will, if they reject that, then how are you going to change that if you're trying to get into the marketplace? You're going to compare yourself against plant-based proteins that are more likely to have an amino acid profile that you're going to be able to market as superior. And I just hope that we keep these things in mind. So as was nicely said in the introduction, I served on the 2015 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, and one of the challenges of that committee, and I say that with a lot of heartfelt sense of pride, was that we were no longer looking at nutrition from a nutrient perspective. We were looking at it from a food and a dietary pattern perspective. And yet we also were mindful that there are protein foods that are still on the plate. Notice that the protein is the only nutrient that's on the plate as opposed to fruits and vegetables and dairy. And the Dietary Guidelines recommends consuming a variety of protein foods with a healthy eating pattern to improve nutrient intakes and health. So one of the challenges that we're going to have, and I think it's based on all of the information that's being presented earlier about the changing markets and the malleability of the consumer to be able to make changes over time, is how are these alternate protein sources going to fit into the dietary guidance? How are they going to fit into a healthy eating pattern when there are no foods that I know of right now that are these alternative protein sources that are going to be able to fit into the way that we are traditionally doing dietary guidance, like eat fruits, eat vegetables, eat a variety of protein-rich foods. I don't see where we're going to be able to all of a sudden say, oh, here's an alternative food to eat. We're going to be able to, we're going to be able to say, here's an alternative processed food product that you're going to be able to eat. So when we look at protein from the dietary guidelines perspectives, and for those of you that aren't familiar, this is a healthy eating index. It's a global look at sort of where we are as a nation in the relative quality of our diets. And all the different numbers, the different bars represent going from very young members of our society all the way up to the oldest group. And you'll see that the gaps are that we don't eat enough vegetables, fruits, whole grains. We eat too much sodium, saturated fats, refined grains, added sugars, and calories. It's interesting that one of the biggest contributors to all of those nutrients and compounds of concern for overconsumption are mixed dishes. And most of those mixed dishes are protein rich, but with proteins that are not necessarily the most healthy, whether or not it be fatty meats, fried this, or some other thing like that. Specific to protein, we actually do really well. It's been mentioned earlier today that as a whole, our protein intakes are fine. Now, there are certainly some subsets of our population that include older adults, that include teenage girls, that are more likely to be consuming inadequate or marginal amounts of protein or low quality protein. But generally, it's pretty good. And when you look at plant proteins and seafood, those bars, that's where the most room for improvement is. It's not that we need to have newer alternative protein sources necessarily. We just need to get them to eat the stuff that we already know is healthy, that has protein in it. Until you're older, and then you get religion, and then you want to see Jesus. Like I don't know whoever was doing that. But the total protein intakes is actually quite good. And so here's the general guidance that you can look at. Select a variety. We have protein food groups that are both plant-based and animal-based. I happen to have worked with the mushroom group, and I'm very interested to see where they're going to fit fungus into this. We talked about it earlier from a protein perspective. Think about how they are trying to market it within a vegetable when it's really not a vegetable. Select a variety of protein foods. If you're going to choose meats and poultry to eat, it's probably better to do it with lean varieties. Less processing will probably add less other nutrients of concern like sodium, and that girls and young and older women are at most risk based on the quantity of protein, not necessarily the quality of protein. Now, it struck me this morning, and it just struck me, but we started the morning by saying, well, we're going to have to replace meat. That was the focus, and that became, so, that was sort of the lens that we started with. And indeed, there are cohort data, like these data from the Women Health Professional Study and the Nurses Health Study, that show that the more servings of red meat that you eat, there is an association, not cause and effect, but an association with your how much red meat you eat and whether or not you're going to die from some sort of a cardiovascular disease-related event. And my note there in red, though, is these types of data are hugely important for dietary guidance and health, evaluating what the health of the nation is regarding what they eat. Yet cohorts data are not available for these alternative protein foods, and they won't become available because it takes literally decades and a stable food supply for us to be able to actually look at this from using the cohort data. So we lose one of our biggest tools that we've used in public health policy. So what are our alternatives? One is the randomized controlled trials. And many of you have either participated in them, done them as graduate students, hopefully funded them if you are in industry. But I wanted to quickly go straight to the most extreme randomized controlled trial that you can do related to protein that I know of. And that is what's called the Optimen trial, which was done in Boston. And this is, you can see that it was funded by NIH with support from the Dairy Council and some other companies that provided products for it. And you can see with the title that it's focused on how much protein is more better to help older people improve, not your nitrogen balance, not your protein kinetics, but some aspects of physical and functional health. And so the primary aim was to determine in older men who already have physical function limitations and who usually consume at or below the RDA, if increasing protein intake to 1.3 grams per kilo, which represents about the 95th percentile of how much protein, based on NHANES data, older people are going to be consuming. Anything higher than that, you would be outside the range of anything, what the typical older adults consume on a regular basis. And whether or not they're going to, by switching to this higher protein intake, you can increase lean body mass, muscle performance, physical function, and well-being. And just for clarity, the higher protein intake, going from the control group 8.8 grams, the higher protein group, their extra protein was achieved by a casein-whey-sein protein blend. So it's not food-related specifically, it's a very high-quality supplement. This was a 2x2 factorial design, randomized, controlled, 6 months full feed. Community dwelling older men, they actually screened, any of you that have done these types of studies, they screened over, or they made contact with over 14,000 people to find 92 of them that were willing to participate. And you can see that these were men who were, had some sort of a mobility limitation. They were at the threshold of frailty, as you might say. And here's the results. The protein intake did not affect changes in lean body mass, appendicular lean mass, trunk lean mass, muscle strength and power, walking speed, stair climbing power, health-related quality of life, fatigue, and well-being. Just because we gave it to them and they actually ate it doesn't mean that it helped them. And I use this really just as we can talk all we want about all of the different science leading up to, but ultimately what we care most about is how to be able to help people that have a need, in this case for muscle or growth of lean body mass, to eat more protein. And this one study only does not support that that worked. Now, I know I'm running out of time here. Just to show you, these are the data, but I will gladly show it to you again another time if you care. So you can probably figure out what this is. It's been mentioned several times, but which is healthier? Obviously, these are the Impossible Burger versus Burger King's regular Whopper. Looks exactly the same. This gives me an opportunity to just say, when you're thinking about products and you're thinking about creating a powder or some other type of a alternative protein that's going to another product, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be healthier. Just because it can sell well or have a label doesn't mean that it's good for us. And it's consumer choice, I understand that. But there's also an emerging concept about ultra-processed foods on health. And I would argue that something with that long of a list of ingredients would be classified as ultra-processed. Now, I would also say that having a regular burger with 12 grams of saturated fat and over almost 1,000 milligrams of sodium is not healthy either. But the point is that just because it's new and just because it's not meat doesn't mean that it's healthy. And the ultra-processing is really going to be, I feel, a real challenge for people to, just because it's new and just because millennials or what it's Gen Zs or whatever want to buy it, That doesn't necessarily, they'll put anything in their body. Just look at vaping. I have teenagers. One last thing, I want to leave on a very positive note. If it wasn't like organizations like ILSI, and if it wasn't like industry partners like yourselves, and government officials that and government scientific experts that are helping to do things like this, these types of things wouldn't be possible. Most of the types of studies that we are talking about have in different eras been done for other protein-rich foods, whether or not it's eggs, whether or not it's pork, whether or not it's soybeans, whether or not it's chicken, or others. And it wasn't, and those of you who do the dairy as well, we as scientists would not be able to do this without partnerships with you, because NIH usually will not fund the types of research that you need to know and we need to know from a nutrition standpoint in order to be able to be successful in actually generating the body of evidence, the portfolio of science that is necessary to go into and do dietary guidelines, or to be able to actually make product claims, or to be able to even do something as somewhat basic as a structure-function claim. So I applaud all of you, and I strongly encourage all of you that are in a position of influence to please continue the efforts that an ILSI-like organization presents, but also please partner with academics and so that we can continue to do the research that we cannot necessarily get grants for. So with that, I'll end, and thank you very much.